1995. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. While the peak era of action movies was beginning to wane, multiplexes were still packed with decent enough action films, and icons like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone were still packing them in, while second-tier action heroes like Steven Seagal and Jean-Claude Van Damme were still trying to punch their way onto the A-list.
Welcome to hell!
It would never quite happen for those two, with both starring in direct-to-video movies by the end of the decade. But 1995, also arguably, was the last year in the 90s when Stallone and Schwarzenegger were at the very top of their game. Schwarzenegger's career would only really falter towards the end of the decade, and he was not really able to recapture his former box office glory following his run as the governor of California in the mid-2000s. But even before then, his box office had slipped, and in fact, in 1996, his film Eraser would surprise a lot of people by only grossing $100 million. Sounds like a lot of money, but for Schwarzenegger, not really.
I'll be back. You've been back enough.
Stallone would be luckier in the 2000s, as he was able to reinvent himself by resurrecting his two most popular characters, Rocky and Rambo, in 2006 and 2008.
It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. How much you can take and keep moving forward. That's how winning is done.
But 1995 would mark the beginning of a very bad stretch for Sylvester Stallone, to the point that for a while, some of his movies, such as ICU and Avenging Angelo, started going straight to video. What exactly happened? Well, there were a lot of reasons, but one had to be the shift in the kind of action movies that were being made. Stallone and Schwarzenegger's muscled breed of action heroes were gradually being replaced by more down-to-earth heroes, such as the ones played by Nicolas Cage in his run of Jerry Bruckheimer movies.
I drive a Volvo, beige one.
But there was another kind of hero on the rise: superheroes. If you can't fight him, join him. And that must have been what was on Stallone's mind when he signed on to star in Judge Dredd.
Court's adjourned.
In 1995, the era of superheroes hadn't yet hit its peak, but Hollywood was starting to take notice. Batman had been a major hit in 1989, and so had its sequels. And in fact, the third film, Batman Forever, would beat Judge Dredd to theaters early in the summer of 1995.
It's the car, right? Chicks love the car.
What's interesting is how Hollywood at the time was never able to come to terms with DC or Marvel for more major films based on major characters. And when superhero movies were made outside of the Batman series, they would tend to be based on pulp properties like The Shadow or The Phantom, both of which were turned into pretty pricey flops. Judge Dredd, of course, would be based on the British comic series 2000 AD. The character was a major success, and soon the idea was hatched to turn the series into a major film. After all, ROBOCOP, a character not dissimilar from Judge Dredd, became a major franchise for Orion.
Thank you for your cooperation. Good night.
However, no Hollywood star was going to do what they should have done to be faithful to the comics, mainly wear a helmet all the way through the film. Heck, even in the ROBOCOP movies, Peter Weller gets to be out of the helmet for long stretches of time. When Stallone signed on to play the role, not only was Dredd's time in the helmet going to be cut down, but in fact, after the opening action sequence, he barely wears it. The premise of the film, oddly, would be almost identical to Stallone's earlier hit, Tango and Cash, where Judge Dredd would be accused of a crime he didn't commit and sent to jail.
I'm so sorry. I let you down.
This time, instead of spending any time locked up, Dredd escapes and spends most of the film roaming the cursed Earth wasteland surrounding his home, Mega City 1. The antagonist would be right out of the comics, and his relationship with Dredd is about the only thing the movie carried over. Both Dredd and his brother Rico are clones, but when Dredd dedicates his life to the law, Rico becomes bad and is sent to prison, escaping years later to wreak havoc. Now, Judge Dredd is widely considered one of Stallone's worst movies. Sly himself dismisses it in interviews, and its director, Danny Cannon, was so miserable making the film, he swore to never again work with a major star, and indeed, he has had a widely successful career on TV, serving as an EP for the CSI franchise, even directing the pilot of the original show. He didn't really go back to movies after this, which is too bad because his career had a pretty promising start with The Young Americans. He was simply not a happy camper on set, and the script by action veterans Stephen E. D'Souza and William Musher Jr., the writers of Die Hard and Terminator 2, makes the movie come off like a poor imitation of Demolition Man. Unlike that film, the satire, which is shoehorned in, has no bite, and the movie becomes utterly reliant on Rob Schneider as Fergie, Dredd's comic relief sidekick.
Mr. I am the law.
Schneider, of course, was also in Demolition Man, but in a much smaller role. The supporting cast here is good, really good actually, but they're largely wasted, with it seeming like the film was reworked into a buddy comedy at the last moment, with Fergie originally getting killed in the first cut of the film, only to be given a reprieve in reshoots.
I'm alive! I'm alive!
Diane Lane plays Dredd's protege and love interest, Judge Hershey, but should Judge Dredd have a love interest? Doesn't really make sense, right? And she does get very little to do, although she does get a great one-liner during her fight with Joan Chen.
Bitch! Judge, bitch!
Max von Sydow plays Dredd's mentor, who exists only really to die in the second act, while Jurgen Prochnow is the secondary baddie. What makes Judge Dredd kinda worth watching, though, is the guy they got to play Dredd's evil brother, Rico, Armand Assante. Him and Sly had worked together well before on Paradise Alley, and at the time his career was doing pretty well, with him coming off the Mambo Kings and a few other solid roles. As Rico, he's doing a full-on Stallone impersonation.
He looks a lot like you.
He's a lot like me. And nothing like you.
And watching him do evil Sly is actually a lot of fun.
You betray the law!
He arguably saves the movie, as Sly's performance is all over the place. He's trying to play Dredd as kind of a quasi-spoof, but at times his own performance contradicts with the movie, as he plays too many scenes with real pathos. It makes the film come off as a bit schizophrenic, whereas Armand Assante is just playing the camp up to the hilt.
You let me judge my own brother?
Stallone also looks really strange in this movie, wearing blue contact lenses. He famously does not have blue eyes, so it's kind of off-putting to see him like this. It's a really weird role for him, and it doesn't look like he's having much fun. The film is really only saved by its jaunty pace, good production design, and those crazy judge uniforms by Gianni Versace. The soundtrack by Alan Silvestri is not bad, but originally it was supposed to be written by Jerry Goldsmith, and in fact he scored the trailer, which has this really interesting march going, but they weren't able to use it for the film, which is too bad because this movie could have used an epic musical score. Might have pushed it a little bit over the limit. The film itself is ragged and episodic, with perhaps the best action beat coming midway through the movie when Dredd and Fergie run afoul of some cannibals. Apparently, the film was recut at the 11th hour to get an R rating, and for a while, Hollywood Pictures, the subsidiary of Disney that was producing the film, even tried to cut it to a PG-13 to go after the Batman crowd. One could see why they might have done this, as the box office for Judge Dredd was nothing short of a disaster. It was an expensive tentpole movie with a budget in the $85 million range, and it only grossed $34.7 million domestically, which was nightmarish. It did fairly well overseas, but it seriously dented Stallone's reputation as a box office draw, and it would be the first of 3 pricey flops that, for a time, put his career in real jeopardy.
The law doesn't make mistakes.
Really? Then how do you explain what happened to you?
In hindsight, Stallone has always said that the movie went wrong in trying to be too serious. Many actually claimed the film was too jokey as it was, but to Stallone, it should have been even more satirical. Whatever the case, a more faithful adaptation of the property was done by Alex Garland and starred Carl Urban, and it got great reviews, but was also a box office flop. So perhaps there's just something about the character that leaves the mainstream audience cold. Judge Dredd ranks as one of Stallone's worst action movies of the 90s, but like a few others in this series, it kinda semi-works as a time capsule thanks to the over-the-top sets, costumes, and the really interesting Britpop soundtrack that includes music from people like The Cure, The, Left Field, and more. It's not especially good, but I'd still say it's watchable, so I give it about a 6 out of 10.
I'll be the judge of that.